Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to the channel. As you may have seen in the channel description, cover a wide variety of topics, mostly sports, but uh, since this is a field that I study a lot, especially a topic I study a lot, as my own little pet project, I kind of want to make a video on that as our first formal video. So, in this video, as you've seen in the title, it's going to be about the existence of God. And in the normal discourse around this, the normal arguments given, objections, replies, rebuttals, there is largely something missing, I have noted. And only something that the argument I'm going to present actually addresses in a satisfactory way. So, let me go ahead and bring up what I'm talking about. Let's see. Okay, so what is the problem that I'm talking about? The problem is going to be that there are certain assumptions, certain presuppositions that everyone makes when they are engaging in this discussion. And very often, these are not addressed. And a lot of the atheists who are also skeptics, these are actually their biggest objections to our arguments and to our conclusion being God exists. So, this is something on both sides, though, that really aren't addressed, and this problem is first going to be raised by David Hume. Okay, so the best answer to this problem, in my opinion, is going to be what we call TAG, the transcendental argument for God. Okay, now I think this is the best argument for God. I think it's been unanswered. I think it's never been sufficiently answered. Atheists have engaged with it, but not to a degree that would be considered debunking or would be considered satisfactory. So let's actually get into the argument. But before then, let's go over some things we need to keep in mind. Okay, so the first thing we need to keep in mind is what Dr. Greg Bahnsen refers to as the crackers in the pantry fallacy. Okay, so what does this mean? The basic premise is that the fallacy is all things are proven the same. That is not true. We deny that all things are proven in the same way. So, is a abstract math problem a proof for a math problem like root 4 equals 2? Okay, would that be proven in the same way as me going back there and looking for a box of crackers in my pantry? No, there will be overlap in how things are proven, such as things are proven by a self with a mind. Okay, so that is going to be some overlap. But we can clearly see all things are not proven in the same way, and this is admitted to by atheists. Every atheist will admit to this. It's not a controversial opinion. And then they say, but prove to me God, an immaterial, abstract, invariant being using physical means. That's what they mean when they ask you to prove God. They ask for a physical demonstration. Well, that's not going to happen. That's like asking me to make a statue out of marble and then saying I can't use marble. Okay, so that is going to be another thing to keep in mind, that they equivocate on what they mean by prove. They mean physically demonstrate by prove. We are not going to do that, and we're not going to be able to do that. Now we can talk about arguments from nature. Nature does reflect God, but it in and of itself will not prove God without the assumptions that we're going to talk about in this argument. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is what we call recursion or circularity. We are not classical foundationalists, so we admit circularity at some point. We say an appeal to final authority, all appeals to final authority are going to be circular in some sense. The question just is, can the circle justify itself? That's going to be the question. And I'll talk more about this in a video about the objections to this argument. I'll do a video 5 best and 5 worst objections to this argument. And as you'll see, this argument's never been sufficiently answered. And I have my doubts that it will be. So the last 2 things to keep in mind are grounding and justification, and epistemology. So epistemology is just the study of knowledge, how we know what we know, whatever you want to term it as. That's what we mean by epistemology. And this is going to be linked to grounding and justification. All we mean by that is give an account for. If I say there's a package on my front porch, then I should be able to give an account for why that package is there and if that package is there. Okay, so that's all we mean by grounding and justification, giving an account for. And specifically, what this argument is going to rely on is not just an assertion. It's going to be, can the paradigm, can the system give grounding and justification for the things that are needing in grounding and justification? And is the system going to be coherent? So those are the things we're looking for. And those are the things that our argument, unlike any other argument, our worldview, unlike any other worldview, is actually going to be able to do. It's not just about coherence. You could live in the world of some atheists where they have to go to these extreme lengths to try to disprove God, saying, what if there's some kind of computer spitting out mathematical algorithms, or what if there was a really simple universe or whatever? Sure, that could be coherent, though I think I might deny that. That's not going to give grounding and justification. Okay, and the last things to keep in mind are that we're not just coming up with this argument, that the form is a solid form that's been used for 2,000 years, but we are not beholden to the people who have used this form either. So anyone who has the basic works of Aristotle will know that his foundational piece, his foundational work, see, I might have it here. No, okay. It's going to be the categories. So the categories, he's going to talk about certain beliefs that are foundational, that are basic, whatever you want to call them. And these beliefs are going to be the case because of the impossibility of the contrary. And this is what our argument relies on in premise 3, which we'll get to the premises in a second. But Aristotle is going to say, for example, that anyone who denies logic is using logic to deny logic. So that's one of the forms of the argument. It starts with Aristotle. It really gains its best, most proper, most well-known implementation in the works of Immanuel Kant, because he is living in the aftermath of the absolute evisceration of the field of epistemology and philosophy as a whole, really, by David Hume. David Hume comes in like a wrecking ball and raises these skeptical objections towards all these beliefs that are considered foundational or properly basic, whatever you want to call them. So that's where Kant is actually going to implement this style of argumentation. And then you get down to the Calvinists, like Cornelius Van Til, Greg Bahnsen. They're going to have this argument. I am not a Calvinist. And this argument is made by many people. Usually, almost all of them have their own variations on the argument. I'm going to have my own variations on the argument. I am a Roman Catholic, and my school of thought or tradition of thought in the Roman Catholic Church is Thomism. So I'm coming at this from a Thomistic bent, while people like Van Til are going to come at it from a Calvinistic bent, and Dyer is going to come at it from orthodoxy. So it's all argued in a little different ways, and I'll argue mine more in line with Thomism. Okay, so let's actually get into the argument. We have 3 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1, X is a necessary precondition of Y. Premise 2, if X, therefore Y. Sorry, premise 2, if Y, therefore X. Premise 3, Y exists. Okay, so let's go more in depth on the premises. And if all three of these hold, we're going to get the conclusion God exists, because we're going to plug in God and our categories into X. X is where we plug in God. Y is where we plug in our transcendental categories. Okay, so premise 1, X is a necessary precondition of Y. Okay, so there are certain things, certain assumptions that I've talked about that are going to be abstract, immaterial, and for the most part, invariant. So we take time, for example. There is no human in history that has ever experienced things from end to middle to beginning. Everyone experiences things beginning to middle to end in a linear progression. Okay, so let's actually get into these transcendental categories, these things that have to be assumed for the possibility of knowledge. They are not physically demonstrated. You cannot go out in your science lab, get your telescope, look under a rock, whatever, and find time or find logic. Okay, so the first one is going to be space, and the second one will be time. So, space and time. Space-time, a spatiotemporal field, whatever. These things are two of the most foundational things that have to be assumed for the possibility of knowledge. Number 3 is going to be the self. We all have a conception of a self, a mind, something that we are that is beyond just a physical clump of matter with gray matter in our head, electrical impulses. We are something different than a rock. We have the possibility of knowledge. That's what a self is, a knower to know things. That has to be assumed. We cannot prove the knower to know things. Okay? Then we're going to have 3 very related things. We're going to have truth, we're going to have knowledge, and we're going to have logic. Specifically, the laws of logic. Okay, so we are not going to be able to materially produce the laws of logic. And some atheists have this absurd contention and argument that given enough time, get in the spaceship, look at the telescope, maybe in the beaker, the stuff bubbling, maybe the particle accelerator at CERN is going to find the laws of logic. I mean, it really is just absurd. They're that dumb that they think at some point maybe they will go out and physically find the laws of logic. Okay, so we can see that those are all related. For knowledge to be possible, there has to be truth. For truth, there has to be a way for the self. It's all going to be related. All this stuff is related. There's to be a way for the self who exists in space and time to logically know these things using certain laws of logic to figure these things out. Some other things are going to be beauty and the past. So beauty, I'll actually talk about this in a video I might release in about a week. That beauty, on one hand, will be subjective, but since beauty is a reflection and instantiation of the divine mind, it is actually going to be objective as well, while having its subjective attributes. But we can talk about beauty as being immaterial and abstract. I'm not going to go find the beauty. I can find something that is beautiful, but I cut open the beautiful woman, dissect her, whatever, smash her into a million pieces, investigate every molecule. I am nowhere in there going to find beauty itself. It is something that is instantiated on the woman or on the art or on the architecture. Whatever you want to call it. This is not something we're going to physically demonstrate. The same is true of the past. I can go out to the far reaches of the universe. I can go wherever I want. I'm not going to be able to touch the past, physically grasp it, bring it back, put it in the lab, and prove it. This is something that has to be assumed, and this is going to relate also because part of what it means to be a self is bound up in the past. Okay, a lot of what makes you you is are past things that you no longer have access to, that cannot be changed, that cannot be proven. And this is Leibniz. They cannot change. And this is classical Leibniz. He's going to argue this. He's going to talk about whether the universe is all flux, chaos, whatever, as many of the atheists will claim, nothing is going to reach into the past and change the fact that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, for example. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. If truth is subjective, we would expect that to change, but it doesn't change, and it hasn't changed. And if it did change, we would not be able to have the possibility of knowledge. So we can see how all of these things are interconnected. Question arises, how does this get us to God, specifically the divine mind? Well, this could last 2 hours to explain each one of these, but from a more basic overview that I'm doing today, the divine mind is something needed to give account for all these things, to house all these things. These things are all so interrelated, so abstract, invariant, and immaterial that they need what Plato would call the world of the forms, Aristotle the mind of God, and what we're going to call the mind of God. They need to come from and in some sense be housed in there. So we can bring up another transcendental category, universal statements. Can we as a human, just a chunk of matter, as the atheists will say, a chunk of matter in a universe that is only matter, can we make statements that are universal? When we have a brain that has access to only a limited bit of the universe, a limited place in the universe, limited information, how in the world are we going to make universal statements unless we have access to the mind of God? Now you'll say, that doesn't prove, that's just an assertion. That doesn't prove that we have access to the mind of God. Actually, it does, because as we talked about earlier, coherence and justification. The mind of God is going to provide both of those things. So as we'll see, if we don't have access to the mind of God, then the possibility of knowledge is going to become impossible. And if, as we'll demonstrate in premise 3, that cannot be impossible, it logically follows we must have access to the divine mind. So like I said, actually getting to the divine mind in a extremely formal and laid out system, we can go over that in a future video that actually talks about the objections to this, maybe goes in more depth like I talked about. So look for that. That should be coming eventually. But since, as we've shown, premise 1 holds, we need to go on to premise 2. Now, premise 2, very similar to premise 1. It could be viewed as exactly the same. The reason I break it up into 2 premises is one is specific, one is particular. So we looked at the particulars of this argument, and that was all bound up in premise 1. We're just going to do a more general look for premise 2 to show that this form actually makes sense. So Socrates, for example, let's say Socrates is sitting right here next to me. What are the necessary preconditions for Socrates to be sitting right here next to me? Well, if he is, then I know with certainty Socrates' parents exist, that the natural means, the marital act by which the generation, the procreation, by which Socrates was conceived, they also exist. And you can come up with a whole host of other things that are going to exist for Socrates to be sitting right here next to me. They had to happen for Socrates to be right here. We're never going to have a formal list of all the transcendental categories. How could we? Okay, so another example is the slave trade. Okay, specifically the transatlantic slave trade. Another way we can ask that question in a less formal way, a more general way, is just Why did it happen? Okay, so I mean, it happens because of the idea of colonization, the labor needs of the colonies, and the actual ability to do it. So the technological innovations in seafaring, in agriculture, in a whole host of things that are actually going to enable the Europeans to engage in the slave trade. So we can see obviously this is really intuitive. Everyone should know this. Premise 2 holds. Aristotle knew it, Kant knew it, everyone knows this one. Okay, premise 3, why exists. This is where things get really fun. Okay, because this argument in its purest and properly conceived form is going to be a comparison between worldviews. So this is where we get into a reductio ad absurdum, and that's just going to be Latin. And what we mean by that is we are going to reduce things to absurdities to show that due to the impossibility of the contrary, they must actually exist. And this is what Aristotle talked about. So we have to assume the possibility of knowledge. Okay? The possibility of knowledge, due to the impossibility of the contrary, it stands. We have to have knowledge. Anything at all. And we can plug in actually the possibility of existence too, not just knowledge. Knowledge is just one that I grab. But any statement, any mental state, maybe you're saying, I don't know. Maybe it's a positive claim. Maybe it's a negative claim. You don't know, whatever. Even saying, I don't know, that is a knowledge claim. To have knowledge claims, like we talked about earlier, logic, truth, the self, which is a knower, the person who, a knowledge giver, a logic giver, a law giver, a person who knows universals, God, all these things are necessary for the possibility of knowledge. Okay? And then we're going to get into justification and what I'm going to call basic positivity. So after we have completed our reductio and found that anyone engaging has some knowledge claim, even if we get to the very bottom level of the knowledge claim, that is still something. That is still something. It still has ontological status. So we are going to call that basic positivity. And from that basic positivity, we can start the long and arduous journey of justification. And if properly followed, consistently and non-arbitrarily, we will end up back at those transcendental categories and then at the divine mind. Now, like we've talked about, atheists like to be arbitrary, and they will end it a lot of times at the physical, or they will end it at these meta categories, these transcendental categories we're talking about. Anything above first order or lower order logic, this higher order logic that we're talking about, that is going to be meta logic, meta ethics, meta knowledge, whatever. We're going to end up at that. And atheists like to stop, sometimes at the physical and sometimes at this meta level. Well, that's called being arbitrary. When you ask them, the atheist who's using logic to argue against God, you're going to ask, well, what is your account for logic? Can you justify logic? Why does logic exist? They say, I don't know. I can't do that. Nobody can. It just is. Logic just is. Well, that's a fallacy. That's called being arbitrary. And once we start admitting fallacies, then I get to say, oh, well, God just is. Debate. I mean, that's just the end of the debate. So it's really stupid that the atheists will be arbitrary. So that's why I said justification followed properly without being arbitrary is going to get you back at the divine mind. So, premise 3, why exists? We'll take knowledge, for example, plug in knowledge, reduce it to absurdities. You deny logic, that's going to destroy logic, that's going to destroy knowledge. You deny whatever, you're going to get down to something properly basic, and you will see that it has some status of existence, possibility of knowledge. At some level, knowledge will exist, and then we begin the train of justification. So, with all those premises holding, we get to the conclusion, the obvious conclusion. why I say atheism is cope. This is extremely obvious. God exists. To deny this is really just to be either stupid or dishonest. And we have to remember, atheism, as St. Paul says, is not primarily an intellectual problem. It is primarily a spiritual problem that will often manifest itself in the intellectual pursuits. So, hopefully, I was able to bring what most people consider a really obtuse, really abstract, really philosophical, and hard argument down to a level that all you guys watching this can understand. I'm looking forward to the feedback. As I've said, I don't think this argument has been properly addressed sufficiently by any atheists. Atheists have come into contact with it many times, and oftentimes they struggle to deal with it because philosophy is not something that modern academia really promotes anymore. So, all the people, theists and atheists, leave a comment, like, subscribe, questions, concerns, objections, whatever it is, leave it in the comments. Hope I can reply to it, or I will include it in the video going over some of the objections to this. So, I want to thank everyone for watching. I know it might be a boring video to some. Maybe some find it very interesting. And maybe it was hard to follow for others. But, this is something that I hope everyone looks into. I think everyone should have a more philosophical mind that they carry around with them. For further reading, look into the first principles and categories of Aristotle, look into the works of David Hume, the works of Immanuel Kant, and the best thing you should actually read on this to tackle the problem of empiricism is the Two Dogmas paper by Quine. I would definitely go read that. So I think from me, that's going to be all. As I said, thank you for watching. And the only thing I want to leave you with is keep reading, keep studying, always stay active, and go Patriots. Thank you.